Welcome to the Notes to My Legal Self, AI Insights, where law and AI collide. Get ready to level up your legal game with us. We've got career advice, cutting-edge developments, mind-blowing legal tech, and more. Know someone making waves in the legal AI world? Nominate them, or even nominate yourself. We love courageous souls. And don't forget, we want to hear from you too. Ask questions, drop comments. Let's build a community of legal superheroes. But here's the deal. We're all about to have a blast. AI may be serious, but we're here to make it fun. So buckle up, get ready to power up, and let's embark on this exciting journey together. Now, let's introduce your fearless host, Olga Mack. Get ready to dive into the awesomeness of Notes to My Legal Self, AI Insights. Let's go.
Oh, hello and good morning. We are on the Thanksgiving time. I didn't think that I would be doing a live 2 days before Thanksgiving, but voila, we had a NIST workshop happen and so much to discuss. I cannot wait until Monday. And it turns out Kathy is on the same page.
Absolutely.
Both with respect to Thanksgiving time and the importance of this. So that was last week.
Yes, it was on Friday, the workshop.
And you, my friend, went in person.
I did. It was an exciting opportunity I just really wanted to be very present. In e-discovery, which is where I've been focused my practice on for the past 15 years, NIST plays a very important role to a lot of our workflows. We have this standard thing that we do. It's called denisting and those files. And to be able to engage in person and participate in these discussions that are kicking off about the safe and proper use, trustworthy use of AI, I couldn't resist it. I had to go.
I love it. So did you just fly in and out like in the morning?
Yeah, I flew in that night, the night before, went to the sessions that morning, and then had some time to meet some people in DC and then flew home. It was a quick little trip, but my husband and I lived in the DC suburbs for about 5 years. I love the metro area. It doesn't take much to convince me to make a quick trip to DC.
It's a manageable, fun, artificially young town. So
yeah,
I spent enough time there. I love it too. I proposed to go last minute. My husband gave me a look and we decided that I should stay home. But instead, I had a different experience. I called in at 6 o'clock in the morning. It started at 9 o'clock Eastern time. The only time I regret not being on the East Coast is when events like this happen. So I called in at 6. I'm usually up-ish at this time, but I don't usually take business calls. I roam around, I exercise, I do things that please me. But I took a call in my bed actually. Bright and early, and my husband was very confused by the whole thing. I think he understood, although I think he chose to go back to sleep. And the last time I did something like this was when Mr. Zuckerberg testified. I was in Sicily in the middle of the night. I really wanted to hear his testimony, and so I was under pillows watching it. And my husband was very confused. Who else joined us in bed? But other than that, so it was a really fantastic 3.5 hour conversation. What is your sort of high level takeaway? What did you think of it in person? I'll share what I think of it remote, but what did you think of it in person?
For me, just from a general kind of like feelings perspective, it's always exciting for me to be, and this happens a lot. I like being in a room where I'm the dumbest person in the room because there's so many things to be learned from so many smart people. And it was a very interesting mix of people in the private sector, people in public, people in research, more policy focused, more AI development focused. And so that to me was just exciting. Sorry, my dog.
No, your dog is excited about this.
Yeah,
what's the dog's
right.
name?
Her name is Zuzu for Zuzu's Petals, and yeah, it's a wonderful life. But
I love it. If
Yeah.
she chooses to show her face, we'll highlight it. How about that?
Okay. I will try to do that. She's always usually on the couch facing me, watching me, or sleeping. But for me, it was just interesting because it's very easy for e-discovery professionals to stay in our little bubble of e-discovery professionals and to be around people who work for this AI focused company or with this policy focus group, or to me, it's just nice hearing their perspective of AI because we do get in our little bubbles because the algorithm is feeding us, the royal algorithm is feeding us content that we want to hear. And so we often see things very skewed from our own established point of view. So hearing broader discussions of it that's more deep in the building of these tools, I think it's eye-opening, the seeing what's behind the curtain a little bit.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, I was calling, so I didn't really see the video, but listening felt a little bit like being a fly on a really cool wall. And I really enjoyed a couple of things. One, it seemed like all of my friends were there from various policy institutions and think tanks. And I was like, oh, I know that guy and I know that gal, and I want to be there. So at 6 o'clock in the morning, under my pillows, I experienced a phenomenal sense of FOMO, which like I actually almost never experienced. And just like yourself, I was like, oh wow, that was a cool idea. And that was a great comment. So that was observation one. Observation two is that it was very multidisciplinary. It was, yes, there were folks from vendors and universities and think tanks and policy and all kinds of stuff. I really like that. I also really, I think as number three, and I'll stop here, is that I was really applauding NIST for coming to it with an open mind.
Mhm.
It was very apparent where they're like, oh, that's a great idea. We should think about that. And they were very open about it. I really love when policymakers come to the table to learn because it was just helpful to hear that. By the way, Kathy, if you have a phone next to you, I would recommend that you move it because sometimes it picks up vibes.
Okay.
I'll move mine. In any case, so for me, that was my top, why I enjoyed it so much. What is the sort of your what is your I'm sure you had many takeaways, but let's start with one. What was one of the sort of important takeaways for you?
I think it was very interesting to observe the discussion of how do we move forward with this? This is our idea. We want to create a consortium. There will be working groups within the consortium focused on these AI issues that are, addressed in President Biden's executive order. And as someone who uses technology in an operational manner and just knowing what project management is like and herding those cats is, we started to get into kind of like the idealized goals versus but how are we going to do it. And to your point, I think NIST was being very open to people's thoughts. The second half of the workshop was focused on let's get your feedback on the working groups, let's get your feedback on resources, and the people there were taking notes, the people they're hosting those sessions. So it wasn't just let's just have people talk. Didn't seem performative, I guess I should say. And to me, I find that intriguing. Like, how are we going to convert these conversations? And there's a lot of big goals that we're trying to accomplish. We would love to be able to participate. I've not been told if the letter of intent I've submitted is going to be accepted or not, but I find that incredibly intriguing. How do you go from theory to practical?
Yeah, interesting. I agree with you. The one thing that was very clear is that, oh, hello to you too.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. That's what dogs do sometimes. Definitely rooted in the executive order. We kept coming back to the principles outlined and what's important there. So that the most recent executive order is definitely the document to keep coming back to. It was very clear that we referred to it many times. I'll start with sort of one takeaway, and I think you nailed it. The operationalizing. I think we all agree that we should do the right thing, do no harm, like all of that. And I keep telling it was usually in the context of supervising AI for lawyers. I think there's very little disagreement that we need to supervise it. I think it's pretty clear that we should and we must. Both that's the right thing to do, and it is in the model rules and adopted by many states. But what's missing is the how, the operationalized part of it. And so it seemed like a lot of discussion was focused on aspects of operationalizing safety and trust, and from various perspectives, and this what that actually means, breaking it down, and that it would need to be a much more thought through prescriptive exercise of what the how actually means, as opposed to left to interpretation, which is what we would just say, go do the right thing. And it actually doing the right thing, even when you have intent, if there is no precedent and you deal with something unusual, it's hard. So I heard a lot of emphasis on how the operationalization of it.
Yeah, and I think there are different working groups. They propose 4 to start. That's not going to be all of them. They're just to kick things off. But even just discussions of how are things going to be approved within the working group? What's this full consensus has to have to be reached? Or how are the different working groups going to be working with each other to make sure those goals are aligned over time? So I think that there's a lot of, again, that project manager brain of mine is just kicking off. And I think it's something that's a skill that I think that e-discovery people can bring to the table in these kinds of conversations, because we're used to just like that whole herding the cats and creating standardization, and how do you do that? Of course, just tooting the horn of e-discovery professionals everywhere.
Well,
But
I do think that e-discovery professionals are definitely the right people to tap into, along with privacy and security professionals. Those are the folks who thought about NIST and data and various related concepts. And if I were to build a department or anything related to compliance in this area, that's exactly where I would start. One idea that I thought was really interesting is someone, I don't remember who, I actually probably will not be attributing many of these ideas that were flown around because I frankly didn't keep notes. But one of the ideas that came up repeatedly in operationalization context is using GAAP, the general accounting, the accepted accounting principles, as a model for having standardized conversation. And now, as somebody who's been a business operator, not just a legal operator, sold many businesses and bought many businesses and tried to have them go through IPOs. GAAP is an important milestone for a company to start complying. The sooner the better. It will help you in fundraising, and definitely through milestone. And it definitely standardizes conversations for the board, and it takes you can keep track of your expenses in many ways. But if you follow GAAP principles, it really does standardize conversation and allows people to have apple to apple comparison and orange to orange comparison, and really helps to get through milestones in a much more streamlined way. So somebody compared what we should be doing in AI, trust and safety, is to essentially create GAAP equivalent so that we can standardize, I want to do the right thing conversation. And I thought that was brilliant.
yeah, there are some groups out there that are moving in that direction, and even trying to build, or they have built out certifications for AI audits aligned with certain regulations that are out there. And they take a gap type of approach to it, where at the end of the day, it's a binary assessment. Are you compliant or are you not compliant? There, of course, is a lot of work to get it to that point. So again, like my practical mind is just thinking about just the effort that's going to be undertaken to get to that point, to have that kind of analysis. I think there has to be some level of consensus as to what are those measures going to be, but that type of approach does logically make sense to me. So there's a lot of work to be done, in other words, I feel like.
Yeah, for sure. I have a few things that I wanted to discuss. Do you have any sort of insight that stuck to you? Oh, I love her nose. So cute. She's definitely enhancing this conversation.
Okay, good. I'm glad.
We're gonna make her stage name NIST
Absolutely.
from now forward. Let's maybe take turns. What things struck you that as interesting, and you think, oh, I didn't think of that, or this is an interesting direction?
Someone asked the question of some of these efforts that we're talking about for compliance. That's easier for a large established company to be able to take on and handle. But what about these startups? What about small companies coming out? Could it potentially inhibit innovation? And the response I thought was very striking from a philosophical standpoint. Just us having conversations around AI safety and trust is very innovative in and of itself. But I think that's a valid concern, I think, for small businesses or startups as we start seeing some of these regulations start rolling out. These are things I've thought of. What kind of burden is that on a small company to have to, if they're going to use these tools, they're going to have to maybe audit regularly to make sure there's no bias? And what's the cost involved, and what's the risk involved? And what does that have to do with access to resources, access to justice, things like that? So that was one kind of, and there were a few questions that touched on that a little bit, or comments that touched on that a little bit. And I think we're seeing some of that play out right now, that tension between innovation and being safe.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. There was a few moments. For me, the moment of maturity happened a few times when a number of folks, including the sort of the moderators, said that safety and trust should be part of innovation. And it's really interesting because I can tell you that increasingly in the last decade, because I've been helping a lot of highly regulated businesses, we've been very actively talking about sort of compliance, safety, trust as a competitive advantage, as something that's not just an afterthought and not just by design, which is a term that now been used for a few decades, but also something that actually helps you in the marketplace, that in itself worthy of innovation and deserves a considerable resources and time. And because if your go-to-market strategy includes safety and trust, it will just go down much smoother. And I really enjoyed how the conversation, there's a number of sort of conversations about accuracy and bias and safety and trust, like all those, again, like slogans that we all agree on, still have not operationalized. However, I think there seemed, at least on the call, a consensus in the room that safety and trust need to be iterated on and innovated around. And it's not just by design, meaning not an afterthought, but that it is actually valuable in the marketplace. And that seems at some point a very accepted in the room principle. And I wouldn't be surprised that it will make it in the end there somehow.
Hmm. Yeah, you're right. I didn't get the feeling of this conversation is a deal killer to emerging tech companies. Not at all. I definitely feel like everyone felt the value and importance of the conversation. And obviously, probably most of the people there are people who have maybe already been accepted to be part of the consortium or want to be. There's some potential bias in that room as far as who showed up. But I think that's all right, that there's a lot of people wanting to do right by the technology and by the people, by the broader community of how do we use these tools? How can we be thoughtful about the broader rollout of them, knowing how scalable they are, all of those kinds of things. And again, even just like in the context of access to justice, whether that's a criminal justice situation or just, again, even a startup. So many startup companies, they don't even have the money to go hire an attorney to help with trademark filings or governance issues. What can we do? What mechanisms may be in place? So it was all a very thoughtful type of conversation.
Yeah, Richard, we have a few folks. We have Kevin saying hello, thanking us. We have Richard who's asking about audits. I've now written a few articles about AI audits. I think that will be important. It was touched. Interesting. I do think that in audits were touched upon in the conversation, but not as, I don't think we're there yet. I think we're still setting up the groups and the high level principles. I didn't really hear the really specific what should be audited. How do you make decisions about depth and breadth of it? How much resources you put in? That I don't think we got all the way there, but I think we did hover over. I think we're trending toward auditing and accounting. And that would be, to me, consistent with GAAP-like principles, because that's kind of what you have in an audited financial. That's part of what you do. So I do think we're trending this way. I don't know if you have any thoughts about audits.
I would agree. In the workshop, they didn't really drill into the minutia of it, just discuss that that is a potential, way these are going to be managed from a compliance standpoint. I think it is probably the way that it's going to go. And I think there is who's going to be the source of truth for those audits. We don't know that yet. There are some nonprofits and other groups out there doing it. I know that you could go to a law firm, they can help you with an AI audit. And what that is probably going to vary from firm to firms. My assumption is that there probably would be some that may be going on now are probably more advisory, making some assessments on the outputs, making some assessments on the data, the quality of the data, and probably procedures around the use of those AI systems. But nothing else was discussed in more detail than that.
So the other thing I thought was very interesting was a discussion of sort of what I think basically amounts to openness, transparency continuum. There are a few folks who essentially said, look, there's a value to an open system, a fish tank. There's a value to a murky system, like a gray box. And there's a value to a closed system, like black box, because depending what's in it, you may or may not want to have full transparency. And I thought it was really mature, just because we have seen a lot in the public discourse about open and transparent principles. And all else equal, that's what we want. However, for example, if you have, I don't know, state secrets or recipe to your proverbial Coke or some other thing that gives keys to the castle, including security and privacy and stuff like that, that a fish tank is not a virtue then. And I thought it was really, there was a robust discussion that we need to start thinking about being open and transparent as a continuum, and that it's yes, it is a virtue, at least with respect to how decisions are made, but what's in it, we need to be much more intentional.
I would agree with that. That to me, I think it nearly makes me think of blockchain to a certain extent. There's so many great benefits to that technology, a public distributed ledger, but you don't want everything on it, obviously. So I think that you have to consider, as with so many things with AI, you have to consider the use case, what sensitivities are around it, and how do you use it in a way that protects those sensitivities, minimizes risk for the company. We, of course, I think as attorneys are very fine-tuned focus on that because of things like privilege and confidentiality obligations to maintain confidentiality with our clients. But there are situations where obviously you don't want it to be a fishbowl situation. You don't want everyone to have access to it.
Yeah, I do think that I would expect the final result to have some sort of mature framework around doing the right decision with respect to transparency and openness, because there was quite a lot of time spent on this. Let me throw one more, and then I'll have you throw another one. There was a lot of sort of emphasis on pre-deployment versus post-deployment, and that you evaluate, however we decide to evaluate, those would be different standards and approaches, and you can't really approach them in the same way. It seemed like there was the folks came back to that a few times, and there seemed a lot of agreement on that. And in fact, some people have thought pretty deeply about pre-deployment and post-deployment as a sort of a pivotal milestone event that warrants extra thoughts and structure around it. And it seemed like it very much corresponds to what happens with respect to when you put out a product in the marketplace. You plan for it, and then you have a SWAT team to see, because things will come up after you release it. And it seemed like we were definitely trending to developing structures and frameworks to do it more maturely and more intentionally.
Yeah, and I think that distinction is what I found particularly interesting. I think a lot of and my take may be wrong, but the feeling I got was there are a lot of people in that room that were very focused on pre-deployment. And I feel like my area of experience is heavily in the post-deployment and using AI systems and having that practical knowledge of these are the points of failure because of humans, either like lack of training, lack of understanding, inappropriate use for that tool, whatever. So I feel the feeling I get is the initial focus is going to be very heavy on the pre-deployment. The post-deployment, I think, is going to be talked about. But I also feel like that's the area that we tend to not focus as much on things. And I think that's an area that can be ripe for maybe more trouble or
No,
room
it
for.
is. It's like this is when you release it into the wild. What can go wrong? Well, everything.
Right. And to me, that's what I always find very intriguing and compelling. And having managed attorneys in large stock review projects, you always have to account for the worst mistake that could happen. And even if it doesn't happen, you have to be prepared for it and account for it and have that in your process and validate and make sure if it happens, it's clear. And I think what so often happens, we see it in data governance where people just create all this data and then we're piling up this data, but we're not good at the maintenance, the not fun going backward, making sure things are defensively deleted. It's the same, I think, with compliance and day-to-day use of post-market, and that's really what I find very intriguing because that's where the points of failure again happen, and I think that there's less time spent on making sure a company using these tools and not just like one general policy. I would argue there should be policies for the different specific use cases, and there should be guidelines and clearly spelling out the validation points and the review process and all of that. Like that to me, I find endlessly fascinating because that is something that doesn't get as much attention. And that's really a major blind spot, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, I agree with both. I agree with both that being a big theme and that there was the group skewed pre as opposed to post. But I think there was a really deep realization that post actually matters because everything pre is actually somewhat theoretical. And when you actually release it in the market, there is a responsible way to release products. For example, you don't have to release it all at once to everyone. You can
Right.
do it to small group to test it out to all kinds of ways. So if you, having a post-release kind of procedures is I think is where we're trending, and I'm not sure I agree with you that the room was the right room to discuss it thoroughly, but there was definitely a realization. What other things did you find fascinating in the conversations?
I think, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. They named four of the starting working groups, and it was generative AI, synthetic content, so deepfakes and things like that, testing out capabilities, and then society and technology. And I'd love to know, did you think that they picked the right first four working groups, or did you think something else should have maybe been a pick?
I thought it was a right for. I think that they actually very in great depth debated how many more they should be adding. So it sounds like they will be adding.
Mhm.
I think that decision I think is made. The question is how many, because it's at some point there is an inverse correlation in the nature between quantity and quality. I think that's what they're trying to balance. Four seems like a good number. I think they could probably increase it to five, six, maybe even seven to keep the quality. But at some point, it's going to be overwhelming. Is including because there was a very sober realization that there are redundancies on those committees and facilitating conversation is going to be at a minimum administrative burden, and what likely is going to happen is a political burden. So I think the committees will be added. I don't think there's going to be too many of them. I think there is an overlap that they need to figure out how they're gonna hash it out and iron it out and share overlapping expertise and competing interests. And it is my hope that they're not gonna go past seven. I would keep it at five, six, seven max. Because again, for quantity versus quality, inverse relationship, political nightmare, and because overlapping expertise. I don't know. What did you think?
I thought the generative AI, as being one. I think that that could create some confusion. So I think not confusion, but what are the specific delineated scope and marching orders for each of the working groups? I think will be interesting to see how they define that out. And I just think like how that cross communication is going to go is very interesting. They nearly need to bring on people who are like ADR experts or court appointed neutrals or something to be that maybe that intermediary. But one thing that they didn't talk about too much, I talked on just a little bit, the synthetic content. I think that is going to be such a challenging thing for us to address that it nearly makes me wonder it because the deep fake concerns, like those are people that are probably not going to adhere to any working principles that NIST may put out. They're going to be bad
Yeah,
actors.
but
And
you can imagine it could be, you
I,
know.
I think it's important. I think it can be very easy to that's gonna be a very challenging nut to crack. I guess that's the point I wanna
No,
make.
I'm not disagreeable. I actually completely agree with that. I'll start with observation one. Remember, there was a really pointed discussion about how insufficient the watermarking technology is. How really it's actually not good enough. You can like easily strip it down. There is not a mature technology, period.
Mhm,
And then I think with the point you're making, the folks who should be adhering to it will not be adhering. And I'm with you on that, especially in the early days. But I think what standards do is that they set up a baseline. And baseline then really becomes a place of creating kind of regulations and all the way to criminalizing behavior, right? Because we don't want to regulate technology, we want to regulate bad behaviors.
mhm,
We're in a stage where we're defining what those are. And the difficulty of doing it today is because it's somewhat unprecedented. And we have some
mhm,
precedent that stealing somebody's content with their copyrights laws and all that. But this is very different because it's actually not new content just based on somebody else's content. So it's a much more gray area. Having standards will start a conversation of what it means to have a bad behavior. Is that using it? Is it using it and not labeling? Is it using labeling but not properly? What about stripping down the label, what it means to label, how much disclosure you need to have? Once you sort of have a somewhat agreed principles of that baseline, then you can decide how far you go to make sure that this behavior doesn't is minimized in nature. You know,
mhm.
can do fines when it comes to companies, but you can go all some of the copyright theft is criminalized. And so you can go all the way to criminalizing depending on the impact. And we have seen that with influencer guidelines. I remember people used to just say whatever, and then
Mhm.
FTC started actually saying this is what you need to disclose. And
Right.
initially, some companies did it because they wanted to be responsible, either ignored it. But at the point you deal with FTC and you are looking at fines, pretty much any company that is paying the influencer will be enforcing that. And FYI, FTC has a direct line to DOJ. Depending how far you go defrauding consumers, you may look at something really uncomfortable. And so that's but I do think what I found very disturbing in that discussion, disturbing, I guess maybe not the right word, but sober, is that the technology is not there to support us. That water, like it was said a few times that the watermarking technology is not good enough.
My concern, not to say we shouldn't pursue it, and there's some great groups out there that are working on watermarking and metadata that will be associated with generative AI type content, is there are always going to be people out there trying to do the workarounds. And a lot of those are also focused on image-based creations and not the text-based creations. So it's a huge, I think, challenge. And it's one that I guess my comment isn't meant to not think it's important. I think it's a very important thing. And I think it's something that is going to be a huge challenge in the courts. We're going to start to see this pop up more and more of deep faked images and videos. And then we're going to need digital forensics experts more and more. And then you start thinking about, where is that impact really going to happen? It's probably going to happen in domestic disputes. So are you going to be, there's a whole other access to justice issue where, some of these people that may be targeted, may not have sufficient funds to hire those experts. There's just a lot of issues, I think, to consider around that topic. It's important. I just feel, adding to your point, the technology is not there. Doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue it. I just think it's going to be
I mean, if anything, it's a call to action for innovators to build. I mean, I think there is going to be a need for that technology. I think that's why, again, going back full circle, the safety and trust innovation needs to be happening simultaneously. It's not about just products that have a utility, but safety and trust also has a utility. And for example, watermarking technology seems there's a big gap. There's a few others. Any other themes that you thought were particularly interesting as we're coming to the end? Maybe one more from you and from me.
Yeah, I think, again, going on the resources, I do have a heavy ops driven mind. I think of resources as time, because that's the resource that I usually bring to the table. But they talked about data, algorithms, just all of that, and just how a reminder that all of this, if anyone's out there who wants to look into participating in the consortium, this is all public domain. So don't bring your secret sauce to the table. I thought that was interesting. But even just the broader thought of how important good data sets are and where are we going to be getting them. We're hearing that dialogue more and more of getting good data to train these systems, I think, are going to be increasingly important. So I'm really interested to see in these working groups, how they address that, what type of data gets brought to the table, who's bringing that data. Of course, I always think of the Enron data set, because that's the data set that we think of in eDiscovery as publicly available. But that was one thing that I'm very interested to see play out.
Yeah, the silver lining of Enron, right? It's very public data set, for sure. For sure. I think for me, the last theme there's a few more themes, but maybe the last theme that I thought was really interesting is this sort of emphasis on interdisciplinary collaboration. It came up in a few contexts. It came up in a context of, hey, you can't talk about inclusion and diversity unless you actually included folks. I think that was part of it. The other part of it, it came up in the discussion of who should be on those committees. And the trend to include folks, yes, subject matter experts, but also include citizens who are impacted. And then this came up in a number of conversations that the users should be at the table. And then the third thing is in the context of collaboration across those committees. It seemed like there was a very big realization that there will be a lot of subject matter experts that speak different languages, and that there is overlap across committees. There is need to be a reconciliation, both in sort of subject matters that is chosen for those committees, but also across subject matter experts. And that may be the experts need to come to the table with an open mind to share and to learn.
Right.
And so those sort of three, it came that sort of community aspect. And actually, I'm going to maybe add this one more insight. Community language is something that has been and you just shared, the Web3 has a lot of influence in this transparency discussion, but also in the community. And that emphasis on the community and the importance of it to police and actually have a function as part of collaborative interdisciplinary language was very openly discussed. I never seen really an organization like NIST to really emphasize the power and importance of community. If you told me that a few years ago that I would hear it from an agency like this, I would be shocked, because that's a language that I'm used to in Web3 communities, or the power of community, the importance of managing it actively, being accountable to it, having conversations, including it, like stuff like that. So that's what I was doing in Web3 a few years ago. Having agency emphasize this interdisciplinary collaboration across experts and users, and then emphasize the power of community to police, to identify bad behavior, to discourage it, and that it actually almost what I heard was that they didn't think it was even possible to do a good job without a community. So
Right.
community is a stakeholder in this conversation. I was blown away because I never thought I would hear that outside of Web3 language, and then let alone in the organization like NIST.
Yeah, it was a very warm and fuzzy vibe. I'm not going to lie. It was very, and again, like how will that translate over time? I hope it does. And I hope that that culture that's being established by the people leading this, I hope that continues. And it's not just lip service, because we have the benefit of looking back and seeing how things were done in the 90s. And we can maybe go, you know what, maybe we can tweak that. And I think we see that in conversations of people being very intentional and being very adamant that we need to have diverse voices at the table, not just at AI. We hear that a lot in Web3. There needs to be women at the table. There needs to be diverse races at the table. There needs to be diverse sexual orientation at the table. It's much more intentional, I think, now, that not to mean that it's always carried out to perfection, but there's a more of an awareness and intentionality around it. And that's always encouraging to see.
Yeah, we could talk for a long time. 25 minutes flew by. I'm glad we actually had this conversation. It almost didn't happen, folks. But it did happen. Maybe
I need to get that AI pin to help me manage my schedule a little bit better and help with translations with the diverse group of people that will be participating.
That's right. That's a good use case. I love that. I love the way you think. Kathy, from your point of view, what is one takeaway you want folks to have from this conversation?
I think if you want to become involved, here's an opportunity. If you feel like maybe you're not, why would anyone pick you? Put your name in there. It doesn't hurt to try and just be involved. We're at a very unique opportunity in the world of technology, the history of technology. So put your name out there and get involved.
Oh, I love that. I'm with you. Definitely an opportunity rich situation. Being in the beginning has its perks, and the perk is that if you don't like the world you found yourself in, you can build another one. And with that in mind, everyone have a great Thanksgiving. I'll see you on the other side. Bye.
And that brings us to the end of another thrilling episode on the Notes to My Legal Self AI Insights. We had a fantastic time exploring the fascinating intersection of law and AI with you. But hold on tight, because the adventure doesn't stop here. Stay connected with us on social media to continue the conversation, share your thoughts, and be part of our incredible community of legal enthusiasts. Together, we can inspire, learn, and make a real impact on the world of law and AI. If you enjoyed today's episode, we encourage you to share it with your friends, colleagues, and anyone else who could benefit from the exciting insights we discussed. Let's spread the knowledge and enthusiasm far and wide.